let's talk about the idea of regret and remorse. So remorse occurs when you buy something in the context of, guitar or music equipment. We're talking about this. Remorse occurs when you buy something and you're like, I shouldn't have bought that. It's that initial, realizing that you might not have made the best decision. Then there's regret, which is something that occurs when you get rid of a piece of equipment, and after the fact you reflect on that and realize, man, I shouldn't have gotten rid of that. So you're fucked either way, basically. You either you're making the bad decision and feeling bad about it at the beginning, or you're making a bad decision and feeling bad about it at the end. When you have the right piece of gear, you don't have any remorse when you buy it, and you never regret having to get rid of it if it's not the right piece of gear. That's the trick. So ideally, if you're buying and selling equipment, you never want to have regret or remorse. And the problem with me is I end up having remorse nearly every time I buy something, and then I have regret once I sell something. That is not the case this morning. I'm happy to report that I am still very happy about my decision to invest in the Katana Artist, and that will arrive today, so I'm super psyched about that. I am also selling an Ibanez 412 cabinet that I had gotten. It was a total impulse buy at Guitar Center. I can't even remember what I was in there for. It was like go in to buy a set of strings or picks or something and then leave with a 412 cabinet. It was one of those type of things. But it was ridiculously low priced. It was $100, and it's one of the Tone Blaster 100-watt cabs. They suck in terms of speaker fidelity. I mean, they're really like, the poor man's 412. But I remember having the Ibanez catalog years and years ago when they had an Ibanez stack, and thinking, at that point I really only was familiar with Ibanez and Crate. And I always wanted, a friend of mine had a Crate stack, and I saw the Ibanez, but it was just the idea of wanting a stack. And that was pretty cool. So when I saw that Ibanez, I was like, you know what? I still do want a stack. I've always wanted one. I've always wanted a big Marshall stack or something like that, or a Mesa stack or something like that. So I obviously am not financially well off enough to have all this equipment, like huge equipment that I really, really, really don't need. So I just buy stuff that I kind of don't need at a more reasonable price. And if I could buy a combo amp for $500 that does pretty much what I need it to do, then that saves me having to spend about $3,000 on a stack that only does one thing. I mean, at the end of the day, let's face it, a stack is really good for being loud and for generating a particular tone. Marshalls have EL34 valves, and they just have a particular tone and a particular grind that really isn't emulated by anything else. My PV 5150 has a lot of gain. I mean, an insane amount of gain. I'm running it on about 12 o'clock right now, and it's just fine for me on the lead channel. But it doesn't sound the same. It just doesn't have the same tube response. It just sounds like a really, really, really dirty Fender, which is basically what it is. So I digress. So the idea of remorse and regret, there are many instances in my past where I have dealt with either remorse or regret. Remorse not as much, but regret definitely, because what happens with me is I don't use the gear that I buy. I'll use it, and it's something that I'm intrigued with and sometimes just out and out enthralled with for a period of time, but then it sits and collects dust, and I don't do anything with it, and then I think to myself, this doesn't really work in my universe anymore. There are other things that I could be buying that are much better options, that are more suitable to where I am right now in my own preference for particular sounds. Because I think it's an evolution. We go through iterations and we decide what we like at that point, and then we move on from there. It's not that we grow, we just move. Sometimes it's a lateral move, sometimes it's a move backwards to simplicity. In the realm of, guitar gear, it's very important to have functionality, and I've talked about this before. It's nice to just have something simple that you can plug in, play, not have to worry about setting up, adjusting, learning how to program, dealing with all of this dialing in, but you just turn it on and hit a button and you're good to go. So the same thing occurred to me this morning in regards to recording, because right now I've got all this equipment set aside. I've got a mixer, I've got my computer loaded with a digital audio workstation. I have just all that stuff ready to go. But the problem is, it's complex to use. You've got a lot of hooking up and a booting up and start the program and do this and do that. And I think that there's a lot to be said for portable recording workstations. And I actually had one at one point, and that's what got me thinking about this whole idea of regret this morning and remorse. That was a situation where I had significant remorse and regret, because I went to a music store and traded a Zoom. It was a 505. I'm not. That might not be right, but it was basically a little multi-effects pedal. And I found out that while the tones were decent, I really didn't like the interface. I didn't like the way the pedal was set up, because it basically had, it was like a poor man's H9 in terms of the menu functionality. It had two buttons on it, two foot switch buttons, and basically one was a bank selection, and then one was a preset selection, and it was just basically scroll in one direction. And that to me was just a pain in the ass, because it was hard to just figure out what you were doing. There was no LED, there was no LCD, there were just a couple of LEDs on different things that said, like, amp model, and then it would have like a couple different options, or modulation or delay or whatever. So it didn't really work for me, so I traded it in at this musical store for a Tascam Portastudio, which was one of the old style ones that took an audio tape and would record 4 tracks. What it basically did was it took the stereo tracks from each side of the tape, and it had a head that went across all 4 of those tracks, left, right, so you could record one thing on the tape essentially, but you could record 4 different tracks. And then you could bounce tracks too, so while you were playing 2 tracks, you could record those 2 tracks, or 3 tracks, depending on what you wanted to do, to that 4th track. So you lose your stereo separation in that sense, but it was just really nice and functional. I ended up getting rid of that later, but I regretted after the fact that I had gotten rid of the Zoom, because I think if I had held on to it, I would have appreciated it more, because I've always had fairly good luck with Zoom products. But I really regretted after the fact that I got rid of that, and I had a lot of remorse when I got the Portastudio, because I was thinking that it would be this magical piece of equipment that would get me recording, and it would get me playing, and it would get me just more, progressing in terms of meeting some goals that I had at that point of actually laying down some tracks. At the same time, I was using Cakewalk, and I had a great audio in on my computer, and I had a good setup, but it was just too much to deal with. And then I ended up getting rid of the Portastudio because it just sat and collected dust. I didn't do anything with it. And then I regretted getting rid of it. So the point is, it's difficult to decide what equipment you should get rid of. I'm going to get rid of the Ibanez 412 because I just don't need it right now. Am I going to regret that? Well, not really, because it never really did what I needed it to do anyway. It never really had the tone. It got loud, and it was a way for me to throw sound through a 412 cabinet from a tube head, but it never really was the quality that I was looking for. So I'm not going to regret that. But I'm thinking of other purchases, and it's tough, so you really have to sort of weigh whether you're going to regret and whether you're going to have any remorse in a particular situation. And it's very difficult to determine that, just based off of the amount of time you put into a decision, because sometimes you can just never put in enough time.